Madam Chair, my name is Tracey Winters. I'm appearing on behalf of Santos. I'm joined by my colleagues, Geoff Atherton, who's the General Manager for Drilling and Completions, Cockatoo-Collins, who leads our engagement with Aboriginal people, and Tom Baddeley, who manages Santos' public affairs in the Northern Territory.
Thank you. You've got a lovely soft voice. If you can just keep it up, please, or move closer to the microphone, I'd appreciate it. Whenever you're ready. Thank you.
Okay. First, Madam Chair, I want to apologise for keeping the panel waiting a few minutes this morning. And thank you for the opportunity to appear before the inquiry. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the Larrakia people, the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet today. On behalf of Santos, I also extend our appreciation for the thorough and inclusive manner in which the panel has conducted this inquiry. As stated in our most recent submission, Santos welcomes the inquiry panel's conclusion in its draft final report that the risks associated with the development of an onshore shale gas industry can be minimised to acceptable levels and in some cases eliminated altogether. Santos has already, safely and without environmental harm, hydraulically stimulated over 1,400 wells in South Australia, Queensland and the Northern Territory, involving more than 4,400 individual hydraulic stimulation stages. We are an Australian company with a long and successful history of natural gas exploration, development and production in our country, and a positive track record of protecting the environment and working alongside local communities and landholders in a fair, open and cooperative manner. We hope we can continue to do that in the Northern Territory, because not only do we think a shale gas industry would be a great opportunity for Santos, we have seen the positive transformation of Queensland rural communities in the Surat Basin over the last 8 years, where local landholders, townspeople and communities have benefited from higher incomes, more jobs and small business opportunities, better education, community and health services, and improved transport and also tourism about water contamination risk of hydraulic fracturing. Of course, proper regulation is critical and Santos supports the objectives of the panel's recommendations in this regard. In closing, Santos supports a robust regulatory regime and welcomes the inquiry's support for objectives-based governance, which will be critical to the timely and economic development of a safe and sustainable shale gas industry in the Northern Territory. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. You have an hour, so...
Okay, we're happy to take questions.
Right. I presume that you've been to places like Larrimah, Bailey Waters, Elliot. If the government lifts a moratorium, what will Santos do to create long-term local jobs in those communities? Not just FIFO.
Madam Chair, I think those are the sorts of things which, as was the case in Queensland, would be worked out in consultation with local communities and local councils. It may be that there are community consultative committees, which we have for both our Narrabri project in New South Wales and which we have for all of our operations in Queensland. So I think those kinds of things are things to be developed in consultation, and certainly they are things that we have worked on with the communities in other projects.
Can you, in that case then, give me some examples, please? Because everywhere we go, quite understandably, people say, well, what is this going to do for us? Realistically, what is this going to do for us? Mining companies have come and gone and nothing has happened. There's no local jobs, there's no training, and we've been left with a mess. So based on what Santos has done elsewhere, can you give me some types of examples, or hypothetical or otherwise, of the types of programs that you would be looking to implement
Okay, Madam Chair, I can really only point to the numbers that I've provided in the opening statement, but in terms of specific policy programs, we're happy to take that on notice.
All right.
But certainly the work that we've done in Queensland indicates that, you know, we have made a significant difference in the communities, and I think we have a great deal of support in those communities.
But, well, that, with great respect, that's not a view that we were told universally when we visited those communities during our trip to Queensland. We heard many stories of many people who'd had very bad experience with the gas companies up there, and in particular Santos.
Madam Chair, we'd be very concerned about those, so, you know, I'm happy to look at any of those individually and look into them, but certainly we're aware of many very positive stories, and our view based on the work that we've done over the years would be that the vast majority of people have supported the industry and continue to support us being there. Can I just ask Shay, who has a comment to make?
To address a specific initiative that's happened around the Roma-Marinara region, in Santos and most other companies will have a rotating workforce, older people retiring, other people just by attrition leaving to other occupations. In Roma, Santos is engaged with the local TAFE, which is attached to the local high school, and through that process Santos has a 12, it changes year to year based on what we are able to accommodate for, but apprenticeship programs specifically with Santos in our fields at Fairview, in June, Springwater, and Wallumbilla. And so what happens is we engage with the local school and the TAFE to do modules so that those boys and girls, sometimes or most of the time it's of a mechanical discipline. Others they may want to do accounting. We cannot accommodate for a lot of those what we would call non-traditional field roles. But the reason why we do that is because we require local people working in the local area, and it's not just smart for business. Economically, it's smart for us because it costs an enormous amount of money that we don't want to spend to fly people in and out of the region. I mean, I understand that in the early days when we have specific work programs with highly trained professionals that we do need, there has to be some give into respect to that early stage of exploration, but once construction and operational phases in place, that's where ideally you want local people working in your local area.
I accept that. The conditions obviously in Queensland, the context in Queensland is very different from, for example, Elliot. I'm just picking a random example. So again, I think you surely must have started to turn your mind to some of what this might look like now if the government lifts a moratorium. And again, people want to know. They want to know what sort of benefits, what sort of employment benefits, particularly in Aboriginal communities, will be created in those communities.
In the early stages, and we have engage with local, as best we can, Aboriginal-owned businesses and businesses that do pride themselves on a Aboriginal participation in their workforce. But I think that's a gauge of where we are. We're a fair way from even construction phase, but we certainly. Well, what we've done in the late last year was engage ourselves with the Northern Territory Indigenous Business Network, which has allowed us to understand more broadly the people and businesses that exist in the Territory. I think what would be required is further down the track, as as if the moratorium was to be lifted, then that will signal a change in understanding what resources may well be in places like Elliot, Newcastle Waters, schools. So obviously you need a school able to deliver modules, tapes, those types of areas, local businesses. I don't think there are any in Daily Waters that are able to.
I was going to say, have you guys been to these communities?
Yes.
You have? Have the rest of you been to these communities?
But we have actually, if you break it down into the phases, for phase one, so to be quite honest with you, we have not looked at the development and construction and all that type of stuff. That's all really. So on phase one, exploration and appraisal drilling, we have actually mapped out what is specialist and needs to come from interstate or overseas. Like big drilling rigs, frac spreads, specialist tools, things like that, and what services we can take locally. So that's already been mapped, and we actually already have a procurement plan in place, and some of the work that Shay spoke about, some of the preliminary work on things like logistics, security, all that type of stuff that we are consciously have a procurement plan of sourcing that stuff locally. We have done some work with some local groups to kind of highlight who can and can't do the work, and we were starting doing the qualification and assessments and all that stuff, and then we've basically frozen the project for the last 6 months, so that stuff hasn't progressed at all since we've been in the current state. But we definitely have a plan in place for phase one of the next 2 years of exploration and appraisal. If we look back at Queensland, the early days go back 8 years, and we were in a very similar situation. So back then, we basically highlighted this is what we can get locally, welding, logistics, blah, 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 blah. But we also, at the time, said we need to build some local drilling capability. So we partnered up with a local Roma drilling company, and we put a joint venture together, financed 50% of the building. In fact, we financed the original purchase of the rigs, 50% partnership, and we built that company to be a reasonable size drilling and workover organisation, so that we would have that local entity available from the Roma area. Now that may or may not happen, but that's the type of thing that we did. Turn the clock back 8 years, that is exactly what we did with local companies in Roma at the time. I think in this case, we've got to get through the first phase. Don't think we're going to be promoting anybody to go out and spend $50 million on buying drilling rigs on ground.
That's accepted. That is accepted.
May not move into a development. That would be a disaster for everybody. So, but definitely local stuff is mapped out in services that if we don't proceed into development, it's not going to cause a catastrophe, because people have bought a whole heap of trucks and equipment and earth moving gear and all that type of stuff. And
I think one of the great lessons learned by our company, particularly in the Marinara region, is when obviously there's a certain population amount, and when the industry was at its peak, what we found was, or what local companies found, was their talent was being drained, and the Marinara region council and local business gave us a pretty good whack over the head to remind us, well, hold on, this is what's happening here. And so as a result, what we did was not just subsidise, we paid for younger people in, again, what we'd call non-traditional roles, hairdressing, IT, even a mechanical apprenticeship at Black Toyota. These are the things that were required by the company to, when we thought we had a social licence, you've got to maintain that social licence by understanding the evolving effect of your business on the local community. So they're examples.
What would be great is from, the same request was made from Imperial and Origin yesterday, was that we would like some details, some further meat on the bone in this respect. Now, whether that's drawn from experiences in Queensland, South Australia, wherever that may be, but we've had a lot of high-level statements from many people, this is not necessarily just directed to you, about the potential for jobs and the potential for local jobs and long-lasting jobs and training and so on, but we've had no details, and we are really quite desperate for the details. And you can understand, I mean, so many people who have come before us in consultations. This was stated in the interim report and it was stated in the executive summary, who said they don't want this. They do not want fracking in the Northern Territory. They don't believe it's going to cause any benefit or bring any benefits, particularly when having regard to the risks. So we would like to start seeing some examples of potential benefits.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair. We will.
Yeah, we'll do that,
we will provide that to you based on the Queensland experience, where we have a lot of information. So we can do that for you.
All right, and presumably there must be some experiences in South Australia as well. Because South Australia, I would have thought, is going to be perhaps more geographically and potentially culturally analogous to some of the areas where this industry may develop in the Northern Territory.
We can do that. I think South Australia, as you say, like the Northern Territory, there haven't been a lot of regional communities developed around the Moomba project by virtue of the land use in the area. But the state as a whole has certainly benefited, and in particular Adelaide as the capital of the state. And of course to the extent that we have community interactions in the Cooper Basin, we can provide details of how they've worked over the years and what we do in that region.
Thank you. Yes,
Could I just add
Professor Hart apparently has a question.
No, just a follow-on, Chair, from your comments. When you're putting together the information, you cite situations that occurred in Queensland. We know about those, but Queensland, in terms of some of the size of the communities there, Roma, etc., very, very different to the area, Baddeley area that we're talking about, Daly Waters, Elliott and so forth. So could you factor that in? To some extent, you just touched on that a little bit with the South Australian experience. I see it as quite different in terms of stimulating the local communities. So if you could address that, that'd be great.
Mm-hmm. Do you have another question?
Oh, yeah, I do. While I'm going, a number of times here you've asked us, I think, to soften some of the prescriptive recommendations, or what you have called prescriptive, to risk and object-based or objectively based. What's your objection to prescriptive recommendations, given that a very large number of the community don't trust companies, with all due respect, or the government, and they would see objective-based recommendations as allowing the company to use their skills and wiles to in inverted commas, manipulate governments. So why not prescriptive?
In large part, I think the panel has covered some of those issues. For example, yesterday there was some discussion about Category 9 wells, and we had noted that the panel had recommended or an equivalent standard. So in those kinds of cases, we understand, we fully appreciate that position. I think in some recommendations in the report it refers to continuous real-time monitoring being available for a very wide range of parameters. Now in Queensland, if I use Queensland as an example, for example, there are hundreds of, if not thousands, thousands of water monitoring wells from which data is collected. The groundwater moves very, very slowly, so there is no immediate impact, whereas if I use an industrial example of an ammonia release from a petrochemical plant, it could have a very, very rapid impact on human health, and so air quality monitoring in circumstances like that on a real-time basis is a good thing to have. It's a very literal example, not a practical one. But in terms of real-time monitoring of thousands of water wells, for example, that may not necessarily be practical or economic or deliver any meaningful data to the people looking at that continuous on-time, real-time monitoring. For that example, we would prefer something along the lines of the process that the Commonwealth has for water monitoring and management plans, where the companies submit the data every couple of years, I think it is, but it could be a shorter period of time, and in which they provide very detailed hydrogeological analysis and interpretation of those results. Now, I think that kind of program would be more meaningful than real-time online data being available on water wells, particularly where the impacts occur over very, very long periods of time.
Or both. You could have both.
You could, but I think that it's yet to be determined, but I think the costs would be very prohibitive, and the technology is also not great to do that at the moment. So
you could provide us with some information on cost and the limited efficacy of the technology?
Yes, we can do that.
Again, there is again, and I'm basing this comment on what people have told us in the community consultations again and again. There's an absolute lack of trust with respect to your ability to regulate yourselves and the government's ability to regulate you. And many of the recommendations, as would be apparent, are designed to protect the environment and also to engender trust. So by stripping some of those away, we get back to the position, or you get back to the position where you're currently at. So if there are cogent, evidence-based reasons why the recommendations are not good recommendations or can be improved, we would like to have that. But again, high generality motherhood stuff, as contained in some of the written documentation that's come before us, is just not helpful to us.
Could I just continue on with a couple of questions?
This is the danger of allowing yourself 50 minutes to be questioned by a panel, I might add.
I'll only do two.
We've got lots of time.
A couple of questions on the water section, water management section of your submission. The first para, which you agree with the requirement or our recommendation regarding extraction licences and paying for it, but you also mentioned there, as did Origin, that all water users should be in that. I just want to remind you, as we reminded Origin, that that's not within our terms of reference. Our terms of reference are specifically to shale gas industry.
Yes,
so it'll be up to the government as to what additional they do.
Thanks, Barry.
The second paragraph with regard to EPBC water trigger for shale gas. You mentioned there that you say that it's not needed. It's covered by other regulations and certainly some of our recommendations. But you cite as the example what's going on in the coal and coal mining and coal seam gas industries are very different, and that was the reason for the water trigger. But could I ask you, What's so different? I mean, fair enough in terms of coal, but coal seam gas, why is that so different? I mean, they still use water, and the groundwater component of the water trigger of the EPC Act is what it's all about. So what's different? Why would shale industry not be needed?
Professor Hart, I think the big difference is the volumes of produced water that occur with coal seam gas production. The difference is that water is used for the actual hydraulic stimulation process, but there is very little water extracted from the shale gas reservoir, if you like, because the shale is a very non-porous rock formation. So I think that's the big difference, and perhaps Geoff would like to say some more about that.
Just before you do, yes, I realise all of that, but the water trigger is very largely about groundwater use, not how much water comes up from the coal seam gas deposit or the shale. I just don't see why you've got a concern about that. It's very similar in terms of the amount of water. Okay, coal seam might be able to reuse more, but the EPC trigger is about knowing much more about the groundwater resource.
We accept that, Professor Hart. The difference we were referring to was, as I said, that the water usage that was of concern in Queensland was about the produced water rather than water usage. Whereas we will not be extracting groundwater in the context of produced water from the reservoir. So that's the difference we're referring to.
But you would accept, I think you would have to accept, wouldn't you, that if you have a trigger that's designed to protect a groundwater use, there would be no sound reason why that ought not apply to shale?
Madam Chair, it could. It's just an issue that we raised in the submission, but it's not a showstopper for us.
Okay. Could I go on to the third para, which is related to our recommendation of prohibition of using surface water? You note there that we've identified the risk of too much surface water being used as low, but I want to remind you, and you went on to say blanket ban's not good. The reason we ended up with a final risk assessment of low was because the mitigation that we recommended be put in place is don't use it. It was a prohibition. So we wouldn't, the risk for a water resource, surface water resource use, it is much higher than low if it's not banned. So perhaps you should read that again. That's a qualification.
All right.
That's the mitigated risk that we're talking about there. And a number of people have I think, quoted us as recommending certain things and not really looked at the process that we've gone through, which is looking at consequences, likelihoods, risk, mitigation, what's the end residual risk.
No, that's a good point that Professor Hart makes. In fact, almost universally, when we have been quoted by various people, including the media, as having come up with a particular risk assessment, they have failed to admit that it is the mitigated risk assessment. Any further questions on? Yes, Dr. Jones.
Yes, one of the issues which is, I guess, come up more prominently, in fact, in these consultations, is this issue of potential liquids being produced as part of the gas stream. Up to this point, we were largely concerned with gas, and the gas that came out of the Wingie well, for example, was dry gas. But now this issue of co-produced condensate and so on seems to be coming up, and indeed, as you quite rightly say, if condensate is produced, it changes the economics. So what's your take on this in terms of your leases and so on? What's your view on this?
Dr. Jones, at the moment, the well that we've drilled, as far as we know, the gas is very dry. The point that we were making was just in relation to the potential of these kinds of resources, and sometimes they may contain propane butane condensate, like the Cooper Basin does. But so far, the gas that's been produced is very dry gas.
Okay, well, I guess my point was not so much the propane and the butane, but more towards the hydrocarbon condensate. The high hydrocarbon condensate's more like the oil in the US, for example. That oil production is driving the gas industry in many cases. Do you conceive that this could be the case in the NT, or is this left field?
I think we need to drill some more wells. I mean, there's only been a very, very small lot, 3 wells drilled in the shale, and only 1 tested. So we've got a huge area to explore.
We understand that Koala Formation might be more prospective in that context, but that hasn't been explored so much.
Maybe. I mean, we haven't flowed anything to date, so...
In the risk assessment we've done, particularly in our water chapter, we've implicitly stated that our risk assessment is based on a dry gas scenario. So we've been quite implicit about that, which is quite important to note. Just taking up a bit more of the, if you like, the monitoring theme, I have been involved with the development of continuous monitoring systems, and I'm very much aware of the technical issues and the issues of real-time quality reporting. I certainly do take that on board from my own practical experience. But on the other hand, as Justice Pepper has said, the community has a really strong perception that the monitoring will be carried out regularly. I use it regularly in inverted commas, and reported openly, transparently, on a regular basis. I think to say 2 years in arrears would not go down particularly well.
Dr. Jones, that, we accept that as well, and we absolutely agree that the reporting has to be open, transparent and regular. I was referring to the regime in Queensland. It could be much more regular reporting in the Northern Territory. It doesn't have to be 2 years.
Well, the other thing is your reference to reporting all analytes at once. So I agree that's an impossibility, but there are certain key things like electrical conductivity, which is a very robust measure of particularly excursions from wells and things like that close in, which I think you should really consider. Particularly at the time of when the system's under most stress, like hydraulic fracturing and things like that, to pick up any excursions that might be occurring, and just to provide that backup. The other thing is you made reference to very long travel times. Now, the devil is in the detail there, because if you're relying on an existing water bore that's a kilometre away, in the Baddeley Basin, for example, it could take decades for you to ever pick anything up, and that's often a problem with monitoring regimes, that the monitoring board's put far too far away from the source to be of any practical use. The horse is bolted by the time you pick it up. So what we're talking about is specific monitoring bores close in. There'd be fewer of them, not every water bore across the landscape, but that closer in early warning system, which is really critical, I believe.
I take it you would have no difficulty with that.
Look, we think that you probably need both for regional groundwater monitoring. Again,
certainly for level, yes.
Yeah, in Queensland we use site-specific monitoring bores and also existing water bores, which gives us, when used in combination, that gives us, allows us to do a much better assessment of the regional groundwater system. So, I think you need both, really.
Thank you. Yes. Professor Priestley and then Dr. Smith.
You'll note that the panel reviewed some of the health risk assessments that have been done for various projects, including 2 by Santos relating to Narrabri and Gladstone projects. And we commented on the variability in the approach taken in some of these risk assessments, particularly in regard to what pathways, exposure pathways, were considered to be complete. My understanding of the basis for not including risks for certain pathways is that the management processes would result in those pathways being incomplete. However, the community concerns are that if things go wrong, what would be the health risk associated with completion of those pathways? Would you be prepared to undertake in any future health risk assessments to try and address this issue of pathways which are perhaps unlikely, but if they did occur, may represent some sort of health risk to nearby communities? And I'm thinking in particular of water contamination pathways and off-site airborne pathways.
Professor Priestley, I can think of no reason why we couldn't do that, but I will take it on notice and come back to you.
Thank you. Yes, Dr. Smith.
Thank you. I appreciate that your comments about water management issues raised in the draft final report are generally supportive, but I just want to take up on some conversations that it seems that you're aware of that we had yesterday about specifically the use of enclosed tanks rather than open ponds, and just wondered whether you had some further comment to make on that discussion.
Yeah, so I think it depends. I think you've got to look at each site on the time of year, the volume of fluid, the quality of fluid, the type, and what you're going to do with it. Now, obviously in the Cooper Basin, where we have huge evaporation rates, we predominantly use large open tanks, as you saw when you visited the Cooper. I think it depends on the time of year. We would still, the easiest way to get rid of fluid is evaporation, I think. It takes no hauling, it takes no processing, it takes all the risk away of moving and all that type of stuff. Realistically, if you're at the end of the dry season coming into the wet season and you cannot move the water out, you have no choice but use enclosed tanks. If there's any risk at all that you're going to get stuck there, you've got road access issues. So I think for us, we would look at it based on the well, the flow back fluids, the amount of water we're going to end up with after fracking, and particularly time of year. I think the time of year and the accessibility and our ease of processing would massively influence what we use. So I see it the biggest challenge is when we're doing the appraisal work, because we don't have any infrastructure. So as you probably saw when you visited Moomba, when we've got infrastructure in place, it's relatively easy for us to pump fluids across to our central processing facility, like we did it. Like I think we saw we were doing Big Lake when you visited down there, and then we have much better capability of processing it. So I think we would have to just look at it on I would be reluctant to say that the lowest risk and most efficient way of working is to have enclosed tanks across the board, because I think it depends on the location and the time of year, primarily.
So yesterday we had some discussions about potentially some hybrid arrangements of being able to use some capacity for evaporation whilst largely containing in enclosed tanks. So those comments that you've just made seem fairly compatible with that sort of approach.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Yes, Dr. Ritchie.
Thank you. As you probably noticed, that in our chapter on Aboriginal culture and protection of sites, we've really drawn on the approach that Santos sort of outlined to us at our earlier hearing. We're at that stage of the report where we're looking for industry support for some of our recommendations. I just wanted to make it, put it to you and take you through some of those recommendations to be clear about what you do support and to pick up anything that you find problematic. So the first two really are quite specific, which is the requirement that it be mandated that the industry gets authority certificates for its operations in the Northern Territory. Is that something that you would support?
That is, hello, Dr. Ritchie. That is something that we agree with and something that is already of standard practice.
Yeah, I thought so. Good. The second one is the recommended changes to the sacred sites legislation to make it clear that it does apply to features that extend below the ground. Again, you've made general sort of...
Yes, and I understand the premise of that question. Our thoughts would be, well, we're very reluctant to support such changes to legislation because of the potential for duplication under the Land Rights Act, and so what we don't want to happen is for the land council's roles to be diminished in any way, and I know that's what the panel is not advocating for either, but I think there's a real danger in that happening if legislations under the Sacred Sites Act is changed or altered.
Okay, I think I'd like to explore that a bit, if I may, because at the moment, if you've seen on our, you'll see the Northern Lands Council submission to us, they believe that the law already extends to features that go below the ground. So we're really looking at just a clarification. The Sacred Sites Authority put to us that, the Aboriginal Areas Authority put to us that the matter was unclear. In practice, there are many sites where features have been recognised as being underground, particularly where it's rock formations that have visible on the surface but extend back under, have been protected, and that hasn't been problematic for industry, and the certificates are issued on that basis. So it's really only clarifying something that has existed in practice. It's not going to change relationships between the two organisations. So I think it might be, I just want to separate those two. I don't think they're the same issue. So duplication. Firstly, just what is the actual problem that you see what is the problem that you would see with supporting the idea of sites extending under the ground, given that you've written to us this morning to say that, just to quote this, it is traditional owners who determine where exploration can take place without impacting sacred sites both above and below the ground.
Yep, that's exactly right. So we don't believe it's for us to say or recommend on legislation to tell Aboriginal people, particularly host Aboriginal traditional owners in this case, on what is a sacred site, whether that's surface or subsurface. I know it's hard, difficult for many to comprehend. But if you're legislating broadly for Aboriginal people and sacred sites, and not giving the traditional owners in that region the authority to educate the rest of us, and understanding that what happens in your region is not the same that reflects in your region, and you need to have that flexibility under any act to be able to give Aboriginal people and empower them to educate and maintain their cultural identity, surface, subsurface. I think it's more complicated than saying we need to legislate this broadly for everybody, because I don't believe it will work.
Okay, well, I'll give you some of the logic. That pretty well all the areas where gas is likely to be developed, if the moratorium is lifted, is in the Baddeley Basin. The Baddeley Basin is largely the kind of land interest held by Aboriginal people in that area is under native title. There is no veto under native title, and so that the way of exercising control over the use of the land comes down to the provisions in the Sacred Sites Act, which make it an offence to carry out works on or in the vicinity of a sacred site. So the sacred site clearance is something that is absolutely central to the exercise of Aboriginal, the right to deal with anybody operating on their country and to make sure that culturally significant places aren't damaged or interfered with. So whether it's the Lands Council doing that, and the Lands Council has a specific role under their Act to assist in that process, and the complementary legislation in the Northern Territory, the Aboriginal Sacred Sites Act, which uses the same definitions as the Land Rights Act, is designed to basically give those rights on areas that aren't Aboriginal land in the communal freehold sense. So I think once accepting the proposition that it's okay and you're quite comfortable with having to obtain authority certificates, it's really then a question of whether, and this is what I just don't quite understand your objection to then extending the right of the traditional owners, the custodians of sites, to protect things that they believe that are important that lie below the ground.
Dr. Ritchie, can I just clarify something? I may have misunderstood this, but are you suggesting that the reason for needing the change to the legislation is because there's no right of veto in the Land Rights Act?
No, I'm not saying that that's the reason for the change. The Act already exists. I'm just saying that without a veto, the only right that is, the only kind of power that ultimately that Aboriginal people who have native title rights that on pastoral leases effectively is through the sacred sites legislation. The bundle of rights that is included in native title includes specifically in all the judgments from the Native Title Tribunal and determinations the right to protect culturally significant places, and the extent to which that right can actually be exercised in the real terms is under the legislation that's set up in whatever jurisdiction for that purpose. In the Northern Territory, it's the Sacred Sites legislation.
Well, it might be a bit more, if you're able to give us time to comment, so if you're okay, we'll take that comment or question
on notice.
That's
fine.
No, that's good.
That's fine.
Yeah, I'm really, we're looking for support in this. I guess just to the next real question, is they were supposed to be the easy ones, about kind of our specific recommendations about changes to regulations and legislation. But do you accept that and then see the reasons for our more general recommendations in that chapter about engaging that broader community in the basin, and that you do actually have a problem if you're going to be out seeking approvals in an area where there's actually a very high level of anxiety, if not to say opposition, to the industry? I mean, that's why we've put these things in, to assist you, and if it goes ahead, because we see it as a real emerging issue.
Well, to assist, but not just to assist them, but also to make sure that when consultation occurs, it occurs fairly and properly.
Yeah. If we analyse the current situation, we'd have to take into account the areas not directly affected by exploration at this stage, and try to understand why people are feeling like this. Is it because of a lack of consultation from us? or is it third-party intervention, or is it both? And I think these, in the way that Santos operates, through the land councils, through ARPA, obtaining sacred site certification, via the land councils, meeting and advising and informing the host traditional owners on the activities, and for them also to be an active participant in the project itself with interpreters, with many of the recommendations you've set down in 11, from 1 to 8, many of those. I think a social licence to operate begins with the people that are directly affected with your operations, and so for people to consent, be fully informed, that is, and be compliant under both acts, the Land Rights Act and Sacred Sites Act, is integral to us beginning the journey of informing the wider community.
When you said third-party intervention, what did you mean by that? Can you clarify that comment?
There's always opposition to any industry, and so I'm talking about people that may not have the best interest of their host traditional owners in mind, and I want to be fair to the vast majority of people that are concerned with aspects of the environment and real concerns around all industries. But what we would like is to have an informed discussion with people without agendas set, and then for people for us to inform them on scientific based evidence, for them to go away and then come back and make an informed decision in that manner. I think I'll leave it at that. I think it's important to be fully informed of the scientific facts, and that's where I think I should leave it.
Thank you. Yes. One last question from you, Dr. Ritchie.
Thank you. Again, you have put to us today that you've support the idea of getting authority certificates, and that you have got authority certificates for all the works that you've done so far in the Northern Territory. And I just need to clarify. You mentioned that you've done some hydraulic stimulation of wells in the Northern Territory earlier in your this winters. Is that right? Did you have an authority certificate for that?
Dr. Ritchie, this was the Marini field a long time ago. So I think the
pre-1978?
I don't know what year it was, but it would have. We could come back to you on that if you like.
It's more to, I guess, my point is that as I understand it, the three certificates issued are all for very preliminary kind of scouting and exploration works, and that no certificates have actually been applied for or issued for anything else at this point. Is that I guess correct?
Yeah, we've had to stop work.
Yeah, but nonetheless, it's really, my question is about experiences engaging with the direction of traditional owners on that particular set of works is something that is yet to happen. Would that be a fair?
I can say that we're committed to being compliant under both acts, so we will approach both. Well, we have to the respective land councils and ARPA for sacred site certification.
But at this stage, you don't actually know how people are going to react, because you haven't actually had to engage them on that particular proposition? Is that
Proposition for
the for hydraulic fracturing?
We have, well, through the land councils and talking to the host traditional owners with land trust. So it's not just 5 people. It can vary to different numbers. We'll explain the project. We'll explain who we are, where we're from, what we want to do for that specific exploration project. I think you're saying, sorry, do you mind me, are you talking about, Dr. Ritchie, about looking into second and third phase of a project?
I'm really just was inviting you to contemplate that this is a bit of an unknown, how the traditional owners are going to react to a proposal to undertake hydraulic fracturing on your leases in the Baddeley Basin, and that my purpose of asking you that question is to just go back to that general point of our recommendations, 11.8, 11.6, which are all about, I'm trying to get an idea of your support for the idea of engaging that wider community in depth, in conjunction with government, lands council, sacred sites authorities, quite apart from your specific industry, a need for approvals for specific works, but to get a much higher level of understanding and across that whole community, and to understand what their concerns are, to inform your processes. That's our intention, and I'm looking for whether you can support that. Or feel that you could support that.
Dr. Ritchie, we will engage very widely. We have everywhere else that we've operated. So certainly we're happy to engage with a wide range of stakeholders. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Shay, that at the same time, on matters relevant to the host native title owners, we would say that they are the right people to be engaging with.
And
I think
they are.
Can I?
Hang on, I just want to let Shay finish things.
And I think it's important to also say and acknowledge that the host traditional owners, the ones that are being directly impacted, are active participants, have fully consented, have been fully informed, and again are active participants in the project, and will continue to be compliant under both acts. I mean, I don't know what else we can say to reassure the wider community that the traditional owners know exactly what we're doing. They do, and you'd be naive to think that they wouldn't understand the future phases of those projects with all of the conversation going around. But that is, but again, the nature of the industry is, well, we don't know whether it's actually feasible yet, this project. So why would we want to? It's probably not absolutely necessary to go into those second and third phases of any project until you actually know what you have. And I think that's where a lot of the conversation has been taken out of our hands. We need to get back to those facts. We simply don't know what the world will bring. Is it feasible? Will people invest? Will the business invest in that region? And that's where we are at this point.
Okay, no, thank you. The sort of yes/no question then is: do you see a value though in the recommendations, say 11.6, 11.8, which are about a more broad and broadly based engagement with that cultural block of people, from say, look, from Nooka down to Elliot and extending out across that basin, because it's been, our reason for having that recommendation is because it's been put to us very strongly that all those groups are really part of a cultural block. They are linked by the Gujika kind of songlines, and that they believe that as a group they should be engaged. Now that's quite different from the sort of, as I say, the approvals you need to do legally to create, for agreements with traditional owners. Absolutely, you deal with the traditional owners, you deal through the Lands Council, through their representatives, and we completely understand that's a process that you have to go to, like, it's a business relationship that you're forming with them. Our recommendation is about creating an environment in that whole region that is fully across what's going on, and that is able to feel that they have a kind of a stake in it, separate from the sorts of specific work that you have to do to engage with the actual sort of legal owners of the areas you want to work on. And so really just looking for yes, no, we see as an industry, we see value in that, or no, we don't see value in that.
Dr. Ritchie, at this stage, I think we can't give you a yes/no answer. In principle, we support the idea of comprehensive engagement, but just as by way of example, not if it disempowers the traditional the traditional owners of the land. So, in principle, yes. But, over time, I guess we need to see how this is implemented, and those kinds of caveats would apply.
No, thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, just quickly, I'd like to go back to the issue of prescriptive versus objective-based regulation. And it's an issue that's raised in your written submission for biodiversity, weed and fire management. And just would like to make a comment. It would be very useful if you could provide some specific information about specific concerns and reasons why that's so that we can take that on.
Dr. Anderson, I'm not sure that we're in a position to do that against every recommendation. I'll just give an example though. As we've said before, there are only 3 wells have ever been drilled in this shale play. So, like you, we don't have a lot of information about it yet, and I think that certainly all of the very detailed objectives regarding well integrity, weed management, fire, setbacks, well spacings, all those sorts of things, the objectives around all of those issues need to be clearly spelled out, as they have been by the panel. But the reality is that having only drilled 3 wells, not having had the detailed engagement with landholders, with traditional owners, with the community, we think it's probably a bit too early to be too prescriptive, because whilst the community or landholders might feel that way now, as we work together over time, collect more data as trust builds, and we hope that we can rebuild trust, then I think that's the time to introduce prescription if that's what people still want. But I think to try to work out exactly what the prescriptive requirements would be now, in the absence of the strategic assessment, in the absence of having assessed the resource more and worked out how we would develop it if we would, I think it's very difficult for us to come back with specifics on prescription.
Yeah, thanks for that. I wasn't expecting that information now, it was more on notice, but still it would be, if there's something in particular that is concerning, it would be useful for us to...
The weed management is interesting though, because there are some specifics, whatever, weed control person or officer, whatever it was. Like, if we look at it, and if we were to define what we wanted, we would probably say we need to have something that prevents weed contamination as an objective. And exactly as Tracey says, so for what that looks like, I don't think we know at this point in time. It may be somebody monitoring, it may be a policeman monitoring, or it may be processes, or it may be other checks and measures. And as time goes on, it might not be as big an issue because we just don't know at this point in time. So I think that to set the objective of not transferring weeds or seeds or whatever it is from area A to area B is a reasonable objective, but to define what that looks like at this point feels really difficult. And it's similar with the well pad spacing, which is we kind of look at the well pad spacing and say, we've got surface and subsurface hazards. We don't know what they are at the moment. So we don't know where the creeks are, where there's any hills, where there's any sacred sites. We don't really know the shallow faulting because we haven't done that much work that to stipulate a spacing at this point in time as opposed to something that gives more flexibility to move sites closer together or further apart to work around various hazards would probably from our side be a much better way of articulating the same objective, because I'm sure that because we're not on a flat plain, we're not in the middle of the desert in a flat plain, I know we will not be having 2 kilometre well spacing because there are definitely obstructions and surface and subsurface that prevent us from doing that.
Yeah, so thanks for that. But I think you'd appreciate that some degree of prescription is appropriate given public concerns, and that the public would not accept a proposition that basically trust us will.
Oh, definitely.
Do it. So,
yeah. But possibly to label it up as a whatever percentage disturbance or something like that gives flexibility to move things around, maybe the more reasonable position.
This is where it's in your interests to give us the detail.
Yeah.
Yes, Dr. Beck.
Yes, my question will start from a specific and then go to a more general, but it does build upon some of the comments that have been made previously. And in respect of the issue of monitoring, it's noted that there's concern about the prescription approach and that the request that the panel consider a risk and objective-based approach. But no details were provided. And we started to tease a little bit out during the questions, but not a lot was forthcoming. And then I go to, I think it's in the introductory section where Santos notes that the panel's recommendations, when implemented, could potentially allow for economic development. But goes on to note that ongoing consultation by government and regulators with stakeholders, including industry, and a focus on risk-based and objective-based regulation will be essential to facilitate outcomes. So one interpretation that could be made from that statement and from looking at the rest of the submission is that Santos, the industry, Santos are going to defer the provision of any details to the stage when government may be looking to modify regulations, and the provision of specificity, maybe not in great detail, but even in some broad outlines which could say, here are some of the issues that I think you might consider in terms of prescription, are going to be deferred until post this panel's deliberations, and you will engage only on those matters with industry, with government and the regulators.
Dr. Beck, I think our understanding is that the panel is recommending the establishment of a regulatory regime for production, and so we genuinely think that that detail will come out as data is collected during the course of the regulatory regime development. So there'll be a strategic environmental and baseline assessment, and assuming that exploration, small-scale exploration and appraisal is allowed to continue, there'll be more information collected during that process, and that is exactly what we've been talking about, and that is how we think the regulatory regime will need to be developed. So as we all learn more, as we consult more with the community on the detail and what we learn from the exploration and appraisal activity and the strategic environmental and baseline assessments, that will allow everybody to have a more detailed conversation.
Accepting that as you go through exploration there'll be more information. Nevertheless, Santos, as you outlined at the beginning, have been involved in oil and gas exploration and extensive shale gas operations in Australia for many years, and you have extensive experience in terms of shale operations. I would have thought that there would have been some principles that you may have cared to have outlined to the panel, which would have articulated in a little bit more detail on some of the areas where you could have thought that some of the objective-based regulations could have been implemented.
Dr. Beck, I'm happy to take that on notice and come back to you. We're operating very successfully under the Queensland regulatory regime and the conditions of our Commonwealth approvals, and I understand that you would have access to all of those approvals which are in the public domain, and the reports which are up on the Environment Department's websites, both in Queensland and at the Commonwealth level. So I guess the specifics we think are in those approvals and that regulatory regime, if you like. But we can say that we've worked very successfully under that regulatory regime in Queensland and at the Commonwealth level, and also in South Australia and in Western Australia and offshore. So I think many of the specifics are in those regulatory regimes already.
Well, again, it's in your interest to furnish us with the specifics if you have them at hand and if you think that they're more appropriate than that which we have suggested.
Okay.
Perhaps just one final question from the chair.
No.
Okay. You made reference to the Queensland regulatory regime, West Australia, South Australia, the Hunter Review, the Hawke Review. Do you accept then that there is still more work to be done to strengthen the regulatory regime in the Northern Territory?
We accept the panel's recommendation that changes to the regulatory regime be made before production licences are issued, certainly, yes.
So do I take that as an answer to my question as yes?
For production, yes. We think that with the changes that have already been made and given the types of impacts that arise, that the existing regime is adequate for exploration and appraisal activities to resume safely.
Thank you very much for coming today and being subject to lengthy questioning. Many haven't. We are running late, but rest assured that that will only cut into our break time and not the presenters who follow. They will still have the same amount of time otherwise allocated to them. Thank you.
Thank you.